Welcome, everyone, on behalf of the Theosophical Society headquarters in London, England. A quick disclaimer, really quick, for all of our talks, please note that the views of our speakers and their presentations do not necessarily represent the view of the Society. Tonight is a very exciting one because we warmly welcome you to receive David Nieuwejaers, first of a series in 3 lectures. And David was born in Belgium and currently lives in Maastricht, the Netherlands, where he also works at university. As an associate professor in criminal law, and since 2017, he has also worked as an endowed professor in criminal law and neurosciences. Some people may still know David as David Roof. I hope I'm saying that correctly. A few years ago, David, however, decided to use his original family name, and that's the name of his natural father, which is Nieuwejaers. And by the way, in Dutch, that does mean New Year. And that was instead of his adoptive name, which is Roof. David has been a student of perennial philosophy and comparative religious thought for the past 30 years. His main field of interest is the wisdom tradition within Christianity, as it can be found in both Catholic mysticism, the Eastern Orthodox tradition, and the Sophionic lineage of Jacob Boehme, known as Christian theosophy. He believes it is crucial that the West rediscovers this forgotten esoteric heritage. And this is in fruitful dialogue with other traditional forms of esotericism, such as Islamic and Jewish gnosis. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Nieuwejaers.
Well, thank you, Anne, for the lovely introduction. Welcome to all of you. These are, of course, very exceptional circumstances still, given the COVID-19 pandemic, to give a lecture. But fortunately, via Zoom, it's available to do that. So that's an advantage with a very great disadvantage, obviously. I'm not very much used to give a lecture via Zoom. Well, I give lectures at the university, of course, with my students. I've been Zooming the past year, my brains out, in all honesty. But this is my first, well, let's say, spiritually minded lecture via Zoom. So it's a little bit exciting for me too. And, well, this is, as mentioned, a first in 3 lectures. But you should note it's not a series, meaning that you have to watch all the 3 lectures to understand all of them. Each lecture stands in itself. So I'm very happy that I'm invited, and I feel privileged that I can give this lecture with the title for this evening, The Imaginal World and the Eye of the Heart. The structure of the lecture will be quite self-evident, I think. I will speak for an hour and 50 minutes on 3 basic questions, which are, of course, immediately triggered by the title. What is the imaginal world? What does it stand for? What is its nature? Why do we need to rediscover this so-called lost continent of the imaginal? This is a very important question, I think, also because there may be a lot of misunderstandings about the whole notion of the imaginal world. The word imaginal, of course, immediately also triggers associations with terms like imaginary, fantasy, and obviously also a link with schools of thinking like Jungian psychology, depth psychology in general. So we have to explore a little bit how all these things relate to each other. The second main question is also quite self-evident. The eye of the heart, here beautifully depicted in the 17th century Rosicrucian emblem by Daniel Kramer. He was a Rosicrucian in the 17th century. That eye in the heart, that eye of the heart, what is it? It seems to be a quite universal notion. All spiritual wisdom traditions try to convey the message that true knowledge resides in the opening of the eye of the heart. And that's an idea that is really to be found in the East and in the West. But again, an idea that needs unfolding, that needs to be unpacked. And again, an idea around which some misunderstandings may arise. And the third major question that I want to address, if I have time enough, is also an obvious one. If we use the word imagination as a form of cognition and not as a form of fantasy, what is then the distinction between true imagination and false imagination? I think a question that we should all be concerned with. Now, these are the general ideas I want to address. But as always, when I have to give a lecture, not only via Zoom, but also in real life, my main difficulty is how to begin. Some of my dearest friends try to tell me, no, David, your real difficulty is not to begin, but how to end. I think that's true. That's true too. But nevertheless, until 2 days ago, I really struggled. How am I going to begin to address this topic? And by coincidence, I read an article in a newspaper which had nothing to do about this topic, but was a small article about the problem of illiteracy in the world. And although we may be very happy that more and more people are no longer illiterate, that the statistics show that globally education has led to more literacy in the world population, there is still a lot to do about that. And there are new forms of literacy. Computer literacy, for example, is still a big problem. People who can't work with a computer. Or financial literacy. I can identify, by the way, with both problems. I can't handle my own finances, and I also have still very much big problems with computers. And when I was reading that newspaper article about the problem of illiteracy and what it creates poverty, it creates economical problems, etc., etc., I asked myself, also when I looked at the emblem which I chose to begin with, there you see an eye and a heart resting on a book, so clearly an eye that is capable to read a book, probably the Bible, since it's a Rosicrucian emblem. So I put one thing next to the other and I said, okay, the statistics show that we are becoming less and less illiterate. In other words, we can read. More and more people can read, and that's a good thing, obviously. But then I asked myself, is it really true? What do we mean with reading? Do we mean with reading just reading the letters, the words, the sentences in that newspaper article, in a book? Or should reading be more than that? In other words, I asked myself the question, are we maybe still not on a different level, very much illiterate, even when we are very good readers, in the sense that we can read the journals, novels, and even spiritual books? And with that, I would like to begin. So I started with thinking about illiteracy, and I want to transpose that idea of illiteracy on a higher level. And the thesis I want to put in front of you is that we are still very much illiterate as a culture, specifically on a spiritual level. So let us ask the question, how good can we read? And then not the newspapers or the journals or novels, but to start with sacred scripture. How good can we really read the Bible? How good can we read the Upanishads, the Vedas? How good can we read the Quran? This is not a new question. In all honesty, if we now just focus on the monotheistic traditions, the Jewish religion, Christianity, Islam, how to read sacred scripture, which is obviously perceived as a form of divine revelation. How to read sacred scripture was from the beginning the most important question. And you could see that, especially in the more mystically oriented schools of thought, within each of these traditions, one agreed that one can read sacred scripture on a literal level, on a second homiletic level, where you can find deeper ethical or moral messages in what you are studying in the Bible or in the Quran. But beyond that, there is an allegorical level, according to the sages of all these traditions. And even beyond that, and then it becomes really interesting, there is such a deep level that can only be read with the eye of the heart. In the Jewish Kabbalah, it's called Sod, the mystery, the secret, the most esoteric or hidden. So clearly, writings as the Quran, the Bible, have different layers of meaning. Now think about that. If that is true, then it stands to reason that the deeper layers of meaning, what Sufis call the outward and the inward, the zahir and the batin, the exoteric and the esoteric, which are flexible notions, by the way. If that is true, I hope you agree with me that that deeper meaning cannot lie in the ink spatters on the paper, cannot lie in the letters, however beautifully they may be written, either in Latin in the Bible or with Arabic calligraphy in the Quran. The deeper meaning does not lie in the paper, does not lie in the black squiggles of the letters. That's quite understandable. You may analyze the chemistry of the ink, you will not get a deeper meaning of the Quran or of the New Testament. The deeper meaning, the layers of meaning seem to reside beyond the literal text. And the deeper meaning does not make the literal text disappear. The deeper meaning unveils itself in the reader, in the one who has a relationship with the text. Anyone else may not see the meaning in the same text. Can you follow? That seems quite self-evident, but if you think of it, back to the original question, are we and have we become more literate? Then I think we can say no, if that would mean, do we really understand what we read? And that may not only be true for the Bible, but even for a newspaper article. And definitely also for good literature like Shakespeare. Let's continue with that question. How good can we read not only scripture, but sacred art? Because the divine not only shows itself in sacred scripture, evidently, but also in sacred art. How good can we read, interpret? How open are we for the unveiling of a deeper meaning, for example, of these glass-stained windows, which are exceptionally beautiful in the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris? Now, tourists will be touched by it. They will feel an aesthetical feeling, a quality, but that doesn't mean that one has really grasped the meaning of what one is seeing. One may be touched by beauty, and beauty may be the splendor of the truth, but it's not sufficient to really let the truth unveil if you don't know what you're looking at. The aesthetical feeling you feel may simply be an automatic reaction, maybe, for a lot of people. And then they go to the next museum or the next church, if they have a tourist mindset and not, let's say, a mindset in which one allows to unveil what one witnesses. One may take a lot of pictures, but what is one taking? The same for the Borobudur temple. A lot of tourists go there, but how can they understand, will they understand the deeper meaning of the temple? And of course, you could read the tourist guide and you'll find a synopsis or some text about the Borobudur's history and symbolism, but that's still not experiencing the Borobudur, if you follow my reasoning. For that, one probably one have to be a Buddhist and see the Borobudur as a mandala. And how good can we read nature? Like the mountain we see there, this is the famous mountain Arunachala, made famous by the Indian sage Ramana Maharshi. And how good can we read a tree? This is obviously, I think, for a lot of people, a question that goes much too far. A lot of people already have had difficulties with asking the question, how good can you read a chapel or a mosque or a temple? For most people, that would not make sense. Reading is book reading. Let alone the question, how good can we read nature? But I believe that one of the major purposes of this lecture is that we need the imaginal world. We need a metaphysical view on reality in order to allow ourselves to read nature as a book, maybe as one of the most sacred books that are written by the divine hand to begin with. And that's not such a strange idea, because again, if you look at the major spiritual traditions, they would all agree on the fact that not only they consider their sacred scriptures and their sacred art to be divine revelation, so not purely man-made, received by man, but not created by man. Look at Muhammad, he received the Quran by the angel Gabriel, Jibril. Well, next to sacred scripture and sacred art, all these traditions will agree that the primordial revelation is nature itself. Nature is a book. Now, if sacred scriptures would have these different layers of meaning as I tried to convey in the beginning, why would then not nature have more different meanings than what can only be perceived with our senses? Follow the reasoning I used with saying that the deeper meaning of a sacred book cannot lie in the ink spatters on the paper. Well, now you follow maybe also the idea that the deeper meaning of the tree or the mountain does not lie in analyzing the tree, its chemistry, its DNA. Not even going to the quantum physical level, which is so popular in certain spiritual circles, will ever give you the deeper meaning of the tree. And I will tell you why. On a quantum physical level, you no longer have any tree. On a quantum physical level, there is no difference between a tree, a mountain, you and me. So if there is any true reality in the tree, in the mountain, in a human being, in anything that exists in nature, then maybe it must exist in the same level as any true meaning within the Bible and within the Quran. But that could only be the case if that meaning exists independently from our own fantasies and conjecture. If meaning is something that can unveil itself while watching a tree, while reading the Quran, while contemplating the Bhagavad Gita, while praying in a cathedral. Meaning does only have sense if we realize that that meaning is something that is given to us and not made up by us. Because if it's made up by me, then my interpretation of the tree is just as valuable as your interpretation of the tree. In other words, it's purely subjective. It's fantasy. It may be nice fantasy. I can even make a nice poem about it. But whether that poetry is really embodying a truth that transcends my own life and even anyone else's life remains to be seen. This is a long introduction, but the main point I hope is clear. Our culture is in that regard completely illiterate because, and that sounds paradoxical, it takes everything literal. Maybe that's also the reason why so many people take everything also personal, but that as a footnote. But our culture seems to be obsessed, since it's a materialistic culture, especially since modernity became dominant, our culture seems to be upset, well, I wish it would be upset, but it seems at least to be obsessed with literalism. What do I mean by that? Well, apply it on nature. Literalism in nature is in the end nothing else than reductionism, materialism, naturalism, meaning there is nothing more in the tree or in the mountain or in any other natural phenomenon than what you see and what we can analyze. And we can understand an organism only better if we analyze it in its parts. But again, I repeat, the more you analyze, the more the original phenomenon disappears. You can't understand even a chicken if you cut it in two. You don't have miraculously two chickens to understand. No, you don't have any chicken anymore to begin with. So if you would really want to have, I would almost say, an encounter with the natural phenomenon which one wants to explore, to understand, to know, then analysis is definitely not the way to go. Which way would then be the right way? Well, I'm trying to convince you the correct form of cognition is what the ancients have called using the active imagination, the creative imagination, the eye of the heart. That will unveil not only the deeper meaning of a tree, of the earth, of the stars, of the sun, but also of all the sacred scriptures in the world. So what if the cosmos is indeed really a sacred book? That's my main hypothesis, which you can find really in all major wisdom traditions. What if the cosmos is a primordial revelation? Here you have a famous hadith, hadith Qudsi. With that is meant words spoken by Muhammad, but the prophet, but not so much his own words. And hadith Qudsi means a hadith in which really Allah speaks through Muhammad. And you can see that in the text. So you cannot find this in the Quran. This is orally transmitted. I was a hidden treasure, God says, and I yearned to be known. Then I created creatures in order to be known by them. I find this still one of the most impressive hadith in Islam, because it shows that creation, the whole cosmos, came from a deep desire within the bosom of God. A desire to be known, and not known in an analytical way, obviously, not known in a pure rational way, but known in a way that is relational. Like husband and wife can know each other, like friends can know each other, like lovers can know each other. I was a hidden treasure, and I yearned to be known. And in order to be known, I created creatures in order to be known by them. Zillions of commentaries have been written by Sufis. What that means. But one of the meanings is quite obvious, that through creation itself, God comes to a form of self-knowledge which is different than the self-knowledge God can have without creation. It is as if through the eyes of all the creatures, the divine has a unique perspective on himself, because what it sees, in other words, what we see via our eyes, what we hear, is really, if you come to think of it, in the light of this hadith, the outward expression of the hidden treasure. In other words, everything is a theophany, a divine manifestation. In other words, a sacred book, a sacred revelation. Guy Eaton, who in his very impressive study on Islam called Islam and the Destiny of Man, I was very impressed when I read that book for the first time many years ago. He says about that the following: the Quran and the great phenomena of nature are twin manifestations of the divine act of self-revelation. Can you all see the slide, or the little screens in front of it? Can you all see?
No, we're good.
Yeah,
yeah,
okay.
It looks fantastic. Thank you.
The Quran and the great phenomena of nature are twin manifestations of the divine act of self-revelation. For Islam, and we may add for any traditional religion, the natural world in its totality is a vast fabric into which the signs of the Creator are woven. So both the Quran and nature are a divine act of self-revelation, and they have to be read, they have to be understood. Here you read in the Quran, a very beautiful surah, truly in the heavens and the earth are signs for believers, and in your creation and what he has scattered of animals are signs for people who are certain, and in the variation of night and day and in the shifting of the winds are signs for people who understand. It's interesting that the Arabic word for sign, ayah, in plural ayat, is used both for the symbol or a sign in nature and for a verse in the Quran. The same word is used. So that shows a very close relationship between everything in nature and the verses in the Quran. They are both revelations of Allah, writings of Allah to be deciphered. Isn't that intriguing? And in the Gospel of Philip, we read, truth did not come into the world naked, but in symbols and images. The world cannot receive truth in any other way. Which means that if we look in the world to the world in a literal way, so in a reductionistic way, only at the surface of the world, we are not really looking at the world. We are not understanding the world. Because the truth of the world is in its symbolical meaning, in its imaginal meaning. The word images already points to imagination, which will be the core issue of this lecture. And here in the Zohar, we can read a similar statement. Oh, I have to go back. I was too quick. I'm sorry. But, oops. God made this world in the image of the world above. Thus all which is found above has its correspondence below, and everything constitutes a unity. That's an idea with which most of you are probably very familiar, because you can find something similar in the Hermetic writings. So what we need is, with an expensive word, spiritual hermeneutics. If everything is a text, not only books, especially sacred books, if everything we perceive is a text, then it must be unveiled, it must be interpreted, and we have to learn to read. And in that sense, we are very illiterate. And that shows itself, as I said, in science, in materialism and reductionism, but it shows itself in religion in fundamentalism and dogmatism, because what is that anything else than taking everything literal and not unveiling the text, not let the text show its deeper meaning? Maybe, and that's just an added, an additional idea I now come up while I'm talking, maybe our obsession with surfaces, that we can't see the deeper meaning behind surfaces, that we take everything literal, is one of the major reasons why we create a virtual reality to which a lot of people are attached, if not addicted, instead. Because if the surfaces, if we can't see their deeper meaning, then there are two ways to deal with it. Either you stick to the surfaces of reality and you become a literalist, or you lose yourself in abstractions, you create an alternative virtual reality. And I don't find it a coincidence that both literalism, dogmatism, and fundamentalism, on the other hand, are competing with ideologies and ways of thinking that create an alternative fictional reality, on the other hand, especially via artificial intelligence and the whole virtual world. I don't think that's a coincidence. And that has to do with the loss of the capacity to read reality. So what we need is a spiritual exegesis, hermeneutics, what in the Islamic esotericism is called tawil. It's interesting, by the way, that hermeneutics is derived from the Greek god Hermes. And that's interesting because Hermes is a messenger of the gods. He's the only one, as it were, and that's why he has wings on his feet, on his helmet, who can go through all the worlds of existence, from the highest spiritual worlds to the lowest worlds. So hermeneutics is really becoming like Hermes, and understanding the correspondences between the worlds. It may be interesting for you to know that ta'wil, which means spiritual exegesis, spiritual reading of a text, but also of nature, as I tried to make clear, is opposite to tanzil. And tanzil is a notion in Islamic esotericism that points to the letter of the text, but also the tree you see with your physical senses, nature as you see it in the natural world. So reality as a descended revelation. And in order to understand reality as a revelation that unveils itself, there is a notion of ta'wil. And ta'wil means literally to return, to take back to the origin. So if we apply ta'wil, spiritual exegesis, on a text, whether a natural text or a written text, we endeavor to let the text return to its deeper meaning, its origin. So to sum up, we can say that every phenomenon, everything we see, is essentially sacred from that way of thinking, but on the surface, it's not immediately necessarily experiential. It's exoteric. The surface of things is always outward and exoteric. The center of reality, so also the center of a verse of the Quran or a psalm in the Old Testament, and the center of the moon, the sun, and the stars is esoteric. Therein resides the truth. And the exoteric does not disappear. It's also not obliged to stop to exist. It remains exoteric. Exoteric will always remain exoteric. The whole meaning of outward remains as it is, and it has an inward. And the way between is a mystical way. That's that spiritual hermeneutics, which I talked about. Now, within Islam, that would mean applied on the religion, that the exoteric are the commandments, the Sharia. And of course, we now have automatically very negative associations with the notion of Sharia, largely due to fundamentalistic tendencies within Islam. But in its original neutral meaning, it doesn't have these negative connotations. It's just the outward commandments and instructions to lead a religious, honest life. But that's only the exoteric aspect. We need a tariqa, a Sufi would say, a mystical path to go to the esoteric truth, the hakika. And that's applicable whether we deal with sacred scripture or whether we deal with sacred nature. For that, we need a guide. We need a guide who tries to bring us closer to that spiritual hermeneutics. And the guide for this lecture is Henry Corbin. Henry Corbin, I'm not going to say too much about him because, you know, you can look everything up as far as I'm concerned for his biographical data. But what you should know is that he is undoubtedly one of the greatest scholars in Islamic philosophy, theology, and specifically Ismaili gnosis and Sufism of the 20th century. He translated a lot of source texts of Ibn Arabi, Suhrawardi, and other Islamic sages. And the reason why we take him as a guide for the rest of this lecture, and not only himself, but specifically the sources of inspiration which he consulted, like Suhrawardi and Ibn Arabi, is because he made, for the first time, I think, in the history of the modern studies of religion, the idea of the Mundus Imaginalis, as he calls it, the imaginary world, available again, accessible again. So we have to say something about him and why he's so important. What was very important in his own life was when he was still quite young, that he discovered via one of his mentors, Professor Massignon, and later on he became the successor of Massignon. He discovered the writings of what will become his own spiritual teacher, namely Al-Surabardi, also known as Shaykh al-Ishraq, the master of illumination. And for him, that was life-changing, because in the writings of Surabardi, for example, in this book, The Philosophy of Illumination, Hikmat al-Ishraq, he found a lot of answers to the existential questions he had, and especially the metaphysics that he found was lacking in a lot of Christian theology. As a footnote, later on he himself admitted and found out that what he discovered in Islamic esotericism was also very much present in Christian esotericism, especially in writings of a more Neoplatonic blend, like in the writings of Dionysius the Areopagite, but later on in the Christian theosophical school of thinking, like with Jacob Böhme, Gichtel, Bader, and others. And also in some mystical writings of both Catholicism and the Eastern Orthodox Church. But his main interest, although he remained a Protestant, was in the studies of Islamic esotericism. And that book, The Philosophy of Illumination, was for him, as mentioned, life-changing. It's good to say something about the title of that book, because The Philosophy of Illumination is only one of the titles you could give to it, because the word Ishraq, which can be translated as illumination, points also to the Orient, to the dawn, to Oriental light. Not literally the Orient as a geographical direction, but the Orient as pointing upwards. So Hikmat al-Ishraq could be translated as the divine wisdom or theosophy of Oriental light. To quote Corbin, when he discovered Iranian Islam, he saw there that that tradition preserved the objective existence of the intermediate world, the world of subsistent images, alam al-mital, or immaterial bodies, the mundus imaginalis. And now we have to explore what that means and why that is necessary to really understand, with the eye of the heart, reality. For those who want to know more about the sources I used, here are two major works of Corbin, Alone with the Alone, his major work on Ibn Arabi. These are, of course, English translations of the French original works, and Spiritual Body and Celestial Earth. There are also a lot of books written about Corbin. I can definitely recommend the impressive work of Tom Cheetham. I have one book of him. If there is one person who knows Corbin in great detail, then it's Tom Cheetham. And he definitely made Corbin more available to the English-speaking world. And Gary Lachman recently has written a book on the imagination, and there Corbin also plays a pivotal role. It may be interesting for you to know if you want to explore these topics further on. So, if we want to know what the imaginary world is, why we need to understand reality and our function as human beings within reality, as I stated, if reality has different layers of meaning and these meanings must be objective, then there must be a metaphysics that underlies that. In other words, if the symbolic meaning of reality would only be a question of psychology, with that I mean purely human, even residing in something like the collective unconscious, then evidently, if all humans would disappear, the collective unconscious would disappear, unless that notion of the collective unconscious has a metaphysical ontology, a reality, independent of our human existence. And that's what the traditional wisdom traditions teach, that the imaginal world is not something, although humans experience it, because everything we experience goes via ourselves, how would it be otherwise? But if I look at a real tree, I will never say it's because I experience the tree that I fabricate the tree. Well, for the same reasoning, the traditional wisdom traditions would say, this is also true for higher levels of reality. Of course, they are experienced in our own consciousness, in different states of consciousness, but they are not fabricated by our own consciousness. They have their own ontology, their own metaphysical status. And Suhrawardi, in that sense, connects himself with the Platonic and Neoplatonic tradition. Corbin summarizes the traditional cosmology as follows. There are three categories of universe. First, there is a phenomenal world, which we see with our senses. Then there is a suprasensible world, the world of the soul, he says. So the soul belongs to that level. With that, we can already fathom that something else than what we ordinarily call as our psychology. It transcends our ordinary psychology. There reside also the angel souls, commonly designated malakut. That means kingdom, because this world is really reigning the natural world. It's in relationship to our world, a kingdom world, so to speak. This is a place of what Corbin has translated as the Mundus Imaginalis, whose organ of perception is cognitive imagination. And there is a third world, the highest world in this threefold division, the intelligible world of pure intelligence or angel intelligence. We could say in Christian terminology, that's where the archangels reside. Or in Platonic terminology, that's the world of formless ideas. In Arabic, the word Jabarut. And the organ of perception is there, the intuitive intellect. Not reason, with intellect is meant an organ of contemplation that is capable of perceiving by identity, by becoming one with it, the good, the true, and the beautiful, but in a formless way, as immortal, eternal ideas, hence the world of ideas. An idea has no form. An idea precedes any form. And the intellect, the Greeks would speak of the nous, is the organ that corresponds with that. So we see there is a threefold division of the cosmos, and the imaginary world is a necessary in-between. That's why Corbin says this intermediate world is as real and objective, as consistent and subsistent as the intelligible and sensible worlds. So it's not something that we humans fabricate. It's not imaginary. It is an intermediate universe where the spiritual takes body and the body becomes spiritual. And the organ of perception of this universe is what Corbin has called the active imagination. Terms, of course, which he sometimes created himself when translating from the Arabic. It is the place of theophanic visions, the scene on which visionary events and symbolic histories appear in their true reality. In other words, if we read in writings like the Mahabharata, in Buddhist mythology, if we read the story of Genesis or Exodus in the Old Testament, we are not reading historical events. There may be historical events corresponding with it, more or less, but they are primarily events of the soul. In that sense, symbolical. Not symbolical as we moderns use the word symbolical. Oh, something is only symbolical, as if it's less valuable. No. From a traditional perspective, from which Suhrawardi writes, and Corbin agrees with him in that regard, symbolical does not mean less real, but more real, because the symbolical world, the imaginal world, precedes the physical world. And if anything in the physical world, including in your own life, has meaning, then obviously it must reside in its symbolical meaning, in its symbolical value. In that sense, our own lives, our own biography, is also a book that has to be read in that sense, like anything else. Also, for our own lives, we need spiritual hermeneutics. Otherwise, we are leading literally superficial lives. We are also then literalists with regard to our own life. I think that's very important to understand, that what we're talking about is really about the survival of the deeper meaning of ourselves, which is nothing else than our soul. So if we put this in a scheme, there are different ways to do that. To clarify, we could say the world of spirit, or alam al-jabarut, is opposite more or less to the sensible world. And I prefer sensible world because if we would use physical world, we would already use a scientific term. We would already be prejudiced and think, oh, this is a word, the world described by physics. No. Physics, I would say, is only a subdivision of the sensible world, namely, as far as the science of physics can discover or describe the sensible world. The sensible world is broader than that. To begin with, it's the world as we experience it through our senses, but that also includes extrasensory perception, which we would call maybe in some circles the lower astral planes of existence. And the connection between the world of spirit and the sensible world is then the world of the soul, alam al-malakut. I like it in putting it in this way, because there you see that the world of the soul overlaps, is really a bridge between spirit and body. And with body, I mean the whole personality, not only the physical body. So if we connect it with man, we can say that the world of the spirit corresponds with our own spirit, which is really not our own because spirit is quite universal, or the true intellect. Remember, that organ that perceives eternal ideas, then the soul, and then our body, which is really the ancient, for the ancients, more or less the same as what we now would call our own personality. It may be good to know that when you read old texts, old Greek texts, old Hebrew texts, depending on the context, of course, but when there is notion of the term body, we should not interpret that in the modernistic way, like since Descartes, where there is a division between body and mind. No, a lot of times with body is what meant the whole psychophysic unity of a personality. And that's not so difficult to understand, because if you would ask yourself if you're angry or you feel other emotions, and you would ask yourselves, are these psychological phenomena or physical phenomena? In all honesty, they are both. You will feel anger, emotion, falling in love, happiness, sadness, as a bodily experience, at least if you're still enough in your body, of course. If you're completely disconnected from your body, then even these emotions may become abstractions. So it's important to realize that unless the context shows otherwise, in a lot of ancient texts with body, it's not just meant the physical body in which you can cut, but also psychological characteristics, which are so intertwined with the body, with our chemistry, I would even say, that in that sense, the ancients were maybe more wise than we are, where we have a kind of a dualistic view between our body and our ordinary mind. In that sense, the soul has to be understood also in its traditional ancient meaning, not as the same as our psyche, which consists of all involuntary thoughts, emotions, and desires we may experience throughout the day. The soul transcends that, is in that sense also already immortal. But, as you can see, it overlaps the spirit and the personality. It has it has experiences, it can influence and be influenced by both. And that's why some say that the soul has different layers, different degrees of showing itself, experiencing itself, of which the lowest are more or less completely intertwined with our ordinary personality, and the highest function like a kind of a mirror in which the spirit may reflect itself. Here are some classical synonyms for the Mundus Imaginalis. I already referred to the Alam al-Mital, the world of real images, true symbols. I will illustrate that in a minute a little bit better. Barzakh is also a classical Islamic term, means the world in between, a kind of isthmus. Urkalia, earth of celestial visions. Ishraq, already mentioned, the Orient. And this one I like. This is one also used by Surawardi, the Na Koja Abad, which literally translated means the city or country of nowhere, or in Latin you would call this utopia, but not in a modern sense of something that does not exist. But when Surawardi means the city or country of nowhere, he means that space of existence which cannot be geographically localized in any physical or chronological time directions. In that sense, nowhere. I want to give you also this quote of Lahiji, because I think a lot of people are acquainted with the idea that, especially if you study some Greek philosophy, or if you have done that we have the world of ideas where Plato is talking about, which would correspond with the world of spirit, and then the intellect. And sometimes that intellect is also called the eye of the heart. And that intellect shows or perceives, experiences the eternal ideas. And then you have immediately our world. So you could have the idea of a tiger, the idea of a cow, the idea of a tree, and then you have concrete cows and tigers and trees in this world. But the importance of what we are now debating is that in between, there is a world that connects the formless ideas with the concrete physical forms. And that was the thing about which Corbin was so excited. Because of course he perfectly knew that within the Western spiritual tradition, Platonism and Neoplatonism spoke about ideas and how ideas can be recognized in this phenomenal world as a world of shadows. And these shadows then point towards these ideas. But that there must be a connection between the two. That for him, that was for Corbin a revelation. And this quote makes that point very clear by one of the famous Islamic esotericists, Abd al-Razak Lahiji. This world of archetypal images, so the concrete images in the world of the soul, differs from the world of Platonic ideas in a sense that the Platonic ideas designate universal forms of knowledge, separate from matter and any material envelopment. While the beings of the world of archetypal images, so in the Mundus Imaginalis, in the imaginary world, are particular forms that are separate from matter, but by no means from all material that is subtle envelopes. In other words, everything that exists in the imaginary world, the world of the soul, has something in common of the Platonic ideas, namely, they represent eternal realities. That's what they have common with the world of spirit. But they have also something in common with our sensible world, namely that they have form, concrete form, particular forms, namely symbolical forms. That's how we recognize these forms. So that's why Corbin quoted Surawardi saying, in this world, the spiritual becomes embodied and the body becomes spiritualized. This means, obviously, that everything here below symbolizes, in the sense of corresponds with the above. And that would be impossible if there would not be the in-between, the world of the soul. To quote another Sufi, Kaysari, for each of the beings existing in the world of senses, there is respectively a captive archetypal form perceived in the human world on the plane of the imagination. Whether it be a heaven, a star, or an element, a mineral, a plant, or an animal, because there are a spirit and spiritual energies for each of them. Otherwise, the universes would not correspond perfectly. I hope you see that when here the word archetypal is used, This should not be confused with the modern day use of the word archetypal. This is a metaphysical use of the term. This doesn't mean that the Jungian meaning of the word archetype could not have a very good function and not correspond with reality. But I think we can say that someone like Carl Gustav Jung was not primarily occupied with metaphysics or with the ontological status of the collective unconscious. We cannot blame him for that, by the way, because he was primarily a psychologist, a therapist who wanted to help people in a way that was transcending the pure analytical materialistic way that was common in his day and age. And I think he was quite revolutionary in that. But things have to remain their meaning. If we read into this text modern day understandings, then we don't understand what Caesari, for example, is talking about. So to make it concrete, let's take our tree again. Remember that I started my lecture by saying, can we really read? No, can we really read a tree? And my statement was, no, we can't. And even the best biologists can't. Even if they would be able to make a catalog of all the physical, chemical, and genetic characteristics of a tree, they are still in the sensible world. Again, if you go to the quantum physical level of the tree, you're not going into a higher world. I would say you're going into a subdivision of the sensible world, even more removed from the world of the soul instead of closer. And I think that's important to realize. Now, if you would like to not only see at the tree as a physical, natural phenomenon, but to understand what this tree represents, or better presents, makes present, then it will be the tree that exists in the Mundus Imaginalis, in the world of the soul, which in itself is a symbolical presentation of the idea of the tree, of which, of course, I cannot make a picture. What would the idea of the tree stand for? Well, in all traditions, you will find the idea of the so-called axis mundi, the world axis. The idea that there is a vertical connection between all the worlds, otherwise they would not be connected. That idea, I hope you see, is formless. But you can get it with your intellect. That idea shows itself in a symbolical way, amongst others, as the tree. Not our physical tree, but like the tree of Yggdrasil in Germanic or Celtic mythology, or the Ashwata tree. Maybe you have heard of that, the tree mentioned in Hindu scripture. It's not a coincidence that all mythologies speak about sacred trees. And we moderns are inclined, yes, these symbolical trees are created by mankind in their fantasy, or they reside in the collective unconscious throughout centuries of human experience. But the beauty of this metaphysical perspective that Corbin has unveiled again teaches us exactly the opposite. There would be no biological tree if there would be not first the symbolical tree, the imaginal tree in the world of the soul, which in itself has more reality and embodies the idea of the tree. I hope you understand where I'm getting at. And probably you will also see that this is a quite revolutionary perspective. So if we now leave the tree, if we leave the idea of the tree and its imaginal form, and we go back to sacred scripture and we read something like the Apocalypse of St. John and his vision of the New Jerusalem. Some of you may know that. I will quote from the Bible, because we not only have to read trees, we also say we have to read scripture. And in that scripture, the Apocalypse, which literally means unveiling, which almost sounds like hermeneutics or tawil, and revelation, I mean, it means revelation. So a revelation that needs unveiling. Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Also there was no more sea. And, interesting it says, God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away, because there's a new earth and a new heaven. And it stated, but the cowardly, the unbelievers, the abominable, the murderers, the sorcerers, idolaters, they shall have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. And he carried me away, so the Lord carried John the apostle, carried me away in the spirit to a great and high mountain and showed me the great city, the holy Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God. Now, how many Christians, no matter which denomination, are waiting for these end of times? I mean, in the literal chronological sense. I think a lot of them. Or others call this, yes, this is a beautiful story, poetical. I don't know its meaning. Maybe it has a meaning, but I'm really not really interested. Maybe we should get away of this kind of strange way of depicting things, and especially when words are mentioned like brimstone and fire. I think both attitudes are incorrect because they ignore the spiritual hermeneutics. They ignore that what is described is real, but not literally real. And in that sense, even more real. So here with a beautiful picture of Gustave Doré, the angel pointing the heavenly Jerusalem. Arthur Versluis says, the new Jerusalem is not of this earth. It is a visionary earth, an archetypal universe in which all is symbolic. Hence it is eternal, situated in the eternal now, present at this very moment, not only at the end of history, but more importantly at the end of time, in the visionary reality where historical time ceases to exist. So the end of time is not something that will happen in the future from this picture, but the end of time means a journey that every person can, follow at each moment, if he would or she would be spiritually equipped. Arthur Versluis continues, we do not enter the New Jerusalem by going to this or that actual place, but by purifying ourselves, by entering into that visionary reality of the imaginal world. And then he refers to these idolaters and sorcerers. They are cast in the lake of fire. That is the outward manifestation of what they inwardly are. So again, the experience of a hellish state is nothing more than the symbolical experience of what a person already inwardly is. Yet the pure of heart experiences not the lake of fire, but divine illumination, not a second death, but all things made new, and ultimately the divine countenance itself.